The first time my stepfather humiliated me in public was at my mother's wedding reception with a champagne flute raised in his hand and a smile that never reached his eyes. The room laughed when he laughed. The band kept playing, the photographer kept snapping pictures, and I stood there perfectly still while he leaned closer to the microphone and said lightly, as if it were a harmless joke, that some people never really leave where they come from. He didn't use my name. He didn't have to. He glanced in my direction, slow and deliberate, and added that the country has a smell you can never quite wash off. I felt it then, that familiar tightening in my chest. Not shock, not even anger, just the cold certainty that he was doing this on purpose, that this moment had been planned and polished the same way he polished his shoes and rehearsed his speeches. I watched the faces around me shift. A few smiles faltered. Someone cleared their throat. My mother laughed too quickly, too loudly, the way people do when they're trying to outrun discomfort. I didn't react. I didn't give him the satisfaction. I simply lifted my glass, took a slow sip, and met his eyes. He looked pleased with himself, confident, untouchable. He had no idea who he was mocking, and he had absolutely no idea what I already owned. The reception hall was elegant in the way money tries to prove itself. Crystal chandeliers, white linens pressed within an inch of their lives, chairs wrapped in satin bows. My mother had dreamed of a wedding like this for years, and I told myself that was what mattered. She looked beautiful standing beside him in her ivory dress, her smile practiced but hopeful, as if hope alone might make everything true. After his speech, people clapped, not enthusiastically, not warmly, the kind of applause that fills space rather than celebrating anything. A woman I barely knew leaned toward me and murmured something about how he had such a sense of humor. I smiled back and nodded the way you do when correcting someone would take too much energy. My mother caught my eye across the room. There was a flicker there, something apologetic, something uncertain. Then he placed his hand on the small of her back, possessive and firm, and her shoulders stiffened just slightly before she relaxed again. It was a gesture I'd seen before. Not cruel, not violent, just enough to remind her where she stood. He moved through the crowd like a man who believed he had earned every inch of space he occupied. Handshakes, backslaps, compliments delivered like transactions. He spoke about his work, about opportunities, about the future. People leaned in when he talked. They always did. He had that voice, the kind that sounded like authority, even when it was saying very little. I listened from the edges, quiet by choice. When he mentioned his company, I noticed the way he puffed his chest, the way his words slowed as if savoring his own importance. He talked about growth and stability, about how lucky my mother was to be marrying a man who could provide. He said it with a smile that suggested generosity rather than control. What no one in that room knew was that I recognized the gaps in his story. I had learned to hear what people avoided saying. I had learned to notice when confidence was too polished, when success sounded rehearsed. While he basked in attention, I cataloged details. A phrase he reused, a claim that didn't quite line up, the casual certainty of someone who had never been questioned. This was not my moment. I understood that instinctively. Power, real power, doesn't announce itself. It waits. Later, as plates were cleared and music softened, he approached me with that same smile he reserved for strangers. Up close, I could see the calculation behind his eyes. He congratulated me on my mother's happiness. He said he hoped I was settling in, finding my place. The words were polite. The meaning was not. I thanked him. I told him the wedding was lovely. He nodded, satisfied, and moved on. I stepped outside onto the terrace, grateful for the cool air. The city lights below shimmered distant and detached. Somewhere inside, my mother was dancing with her new husband, her hand resting where he guided it. I wondered if she felt the same unease I did, or if she had learned to push it aside the way she had pushed aside so many small discomforts over the years. Standing there alone, I thought about how many times I had been told to be patient, to be understanding, to not make things harder than they needed to be. I thought about how often silence had been framed as maturity, as grace, and I thought about how useful that silence had been for people like him. I didn't hate him, not in that moment. Hate requires energy, and I was conserving mine. What I felt instead was clarity. He believed he had measured me correctly. He believed he knew exactly where I belonged. He believed that whatever I was, whatever I had become, could never threaten him. That belief was going to cost him everything. When I went back inside, my mother caught my hand and squeezed it. Her palm was warm, her grip uncertain. She asked if I was all right. I told her I was fine. It wasn't a lie. It was simply incomplete. The band started another song. Guests returned to their tables. The night moved forward, unaware of the fault line running straight through it. I took my seat, folded my napkin, and smiled at the couple as they toasted to new beginnings. What none of them realized was that this was not a beginning for me. It was a confirmation, a final unmistakable signal that the life I had built in quiet, careful steps was about to intersect with his in a way he would never see coming. And when it did, there would be no jokes to hide behind. The music from the reception followed me even after I stepped outside, muffled by glass and distance, like a memory I couldn't quite shake. I stood there longer than I meant to, letting the night air cool my skin, until the past came back the way it always did. Not all at once. Slowly. In pieces. Before him. Before the smiles that didn't reach eyes. Before my mother learned how to make herself smaller. There was a time when our life was simple in a way that didn't need explaining. Not perfect. Not easy. Just ours. My mother raised me in a narrow, 2-bedroom house on the edge of a town most people only pass through on their way somewhere else. The kind of place with one main road, 2 gas stations, and a diner that knew everyone's order before they sat down. She worked at the county records office, steady hours, steady pay, the kind of job that didn't impress anyone but never surprised us either. I learned early that stability wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. We didn't have much, but we had routines. Sunday mornings were for pancakes. She always burned the first one and pretended it was on purpose. Evenings were quiet, spent at the kitchen table while I did homework, and she sorted paperwork she brought home in a canvas tote. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we didn't. Silence between us was never uncomfortable. It was restful. When people asked about my father, my mother answered without bitterness. He had left when I was young, not in a dramatic way, just gradually. Fewer calls, missed birthdays, promises that softened into excuses. Eventually, absence became the only thing he was consistent about. My mother never spoke badly of him. She didn't need to. The truth was visible in the spaces he left behind. Losing him didn't break us. It changed us. My mother learned to carry everything herself. Bills, decisions, worry. I learned how to notice when she was tired without her saying it. I learned how to help without being asked. Independence wasn't something she preached. It was something she modeled every day. She taught me how to manage money by handing me the grocery list and a calculator. She taught me how to speak to adults by letting me sit beside her when she made phone calls. She taught me that dignity wasn't about being loud, but about not apologizing for taking up space. At the time, I didn't realize those lessons were forming the spine of who I would become. I just knew I trusted her. Completely. There were evenings when she came home quieter than usual, shoulders sagging as she set her keys down. On those nights, she would sit at the table and stare at nothing for a moment before noticing me watching. Then she would smile, that same quick smile she wore at the wedding, and ask about my day. I knew enough not to push. I knew enough to wait. Loneliness doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it shows up as fatigue. Sometimes it shows up as practicality. My mother didn't talk about being lonely. She talked about getting older, about wanting someone to share responsibility with someday, about how it might be nice not to do everything alone forever. She said it casually, like a hypothetical. I heard the longing underneath anyway. I grew up believing we had already survived the hardest part. The worst thing had happened, and we had made it through. I thought the future would be easier by default. I didn't know yet how wrong that assumption could be. The first real shift was subtle. She started coming home later some evenings. She changed her hair. Nothing drastic, just enough that I noticed. She mentioned a new acquaintance from work, someone who asked thoughtful questions, someone who listened. She didn't use his name at first. She didn't need to. I could hear the difference in her voice when she talked about him. Lighter, careful, hopeful. When she finally brought him up directly, it was over dinner. She said she'd met someone. She said she wasn't sure where it was going. She said she wanted me to know before anything changed. I remember nodding, telling her I was happy if she was happy, and I meant it. I wanted her to have more than survival. I wanted her to have ease. The night she told me she was going to introduce him to me, I barely slept. Not because I was afraid, because I was curious. I had spent my life as the other adult in the house, the quiet witness to my mother's strength. The idea of someone stepping into that space felt strange, but not threatening. Not yet. Before he ever spoke my name, before he corrected her sentences or joked at my expense, I remember thinking how nice it would be if she didn't have to carry everything alone anymore. I remember believing that love could only add, not subtract, that it would make us stronger, not smaller. I didn't know then how easily good intentions could be weaponized. Looking back, I can see the first cracks forming before the foundation ever gave way. The way she started checking her phone more often, the way she hesitated before making plans, the way she laughed a second longer than necessary, as if to prove she was enjoying herself. At the time, I told myself these were normal changes, signs of a woman opening her life to something new. I thought our bond was unbreakable because it had survived everything else. I didn't understand that some things don't break bonds outright. They stretch them, thin them, pull them so tight that one small pressure can tear them clean in two. Standing outside the wedding reception years later, I could trace the line from those early moments to where we were now. I could see how vulnerability had been mistaken for weakness, how wanting companionship had been reframed as needing guidance, how the language of care had slowly replaced the language of choice. If I had known then what I know now, I would have asked harder questions. I would have paid closer attention. But hindsight is a luxury that only comes after damage has already been done. At the time, all I knew was that my mother deserved happiness, and I believed happiness would never ask her to give up herself in exchange. That belief was the last truly innocent thing I ever held. He arrived on a Thursday evening with a bottle of wine tucked under his arm and a confidence that filled the doorway before he did. My mother stood a little straighter when she introduced him, smoothing her blouse the way she did when she wanted to make a good impression. He smiled at me first, not warmly, not coldly either, but with a look that lingered just long enough to feel like an assessment. "This is my daughter," she said. "I already knew that," he replied lightly, extending his hand. "I've heard so much about you." His handshake was firm, practiced, the kind of grip people use when they want to establish something without saying it out loud. I told him my name. He repeated it once carefully as if filing it away. From the beginning, he acted like a guest who expected to become permanent. He complimented the house not excessively, but enough to signal approval. He asked my mother about her work, nodded at her answers, and mirrored her language back to her in a way that made her relax. I watched him do it the way he leaned in slightly when she spoke, the way he laughed just a beat after she did. It was subtle, efficient. When he turned his attention to me, his questions came wrapped in curiosity. What did I do? What were my plans? Where did I see myself in 5 years? The questions themselves weren't offensive. It was the tone. The way each answer seemed to be measured against an invisible standard I hadn't agreed to. I told him I was working and saving, that I wasn't in a rush. He smiled again and said patience was an underrated quality. The words sounded like praise. They didn't feel like it. Dinner was polite, too polite. My mother cooked more than she usually did, filling the table with dishes she hadn't made in years. He noticed. He commented on it, told her she spoiled people. She laughed and waved it off, but I saw the color rise in her cheeks. Appreciation did that to her. It always had. As the evening went on, I realized he rarely asked questions he didn't already have answers to. When my mother spoke, he gently reframed her sentences, adding details, smoothing edges. When I spoke, he listened without interruption, then responded with a summary that didn't quite match what I'd said. It was impressive in a way. He made conversation feel collaborative, while quietly steering it where he wanted. The first time I saw him correct my mother, it was over something insignificant. She mentioned a weekend plan. He smiled and said it might be better to wait, given her workload. His voice was calm, reasonable. She hesitated, then nodded, adjusting her sentence mid-thought. He kissed her cheek like he had done her a favor. I felt a small chill then, not alarm, just recognition. I had seen that pattern before in offices and meetings in rooms where power pretended to be concern. When he left that night, my mother stood by the window longer than necessary watching his car disappear down the street. She asked me what I thought. I said he seemed nice. I chose my words carefully. She smiled with relief, as if my approval mattered more than she wanted to admit. After that, he became a regular presence. He showed up with groceries. He fixed a loose cabinet door. He remembered small details and brought them up later, proof that he listened. He didn't push his way in. He eased himself into the spaces we had once occupied alone. The more comfortable he became, the less invisible his influence was. He rearranged things, not furniture at first, but ideas. He suggested my mother work less overtime, that she deserved rest, that she shouldn't worry so much about finances. He spoke about stability and security, about planning for the future. My mother listened with the kind of attention usually reserved for authority. When he spoke to me, the warmth cooled slightly. Not enough to be obvious, just enough that I noticed. He asked fewer questions and made more statements. He told me independence was admirable, but direction was better. He said young people often confused freedom with aimlessness. I smiled and nodded. Arguing felt pointless. He wasn't talking to understand me. He was talking to position me. One evening, while my mother was in the kitchen, he sat across from me and lowered his voice. He said change was hard for families, that transitions required flexibility, that my mother needed support right now, not tension. He never said I was the tension. He didn't have to. When I told my mother later that some of his comments made me uncomfortable, she frowned in confusion. She said he was just trying to help, that he came from a different background, that I might be misinterpreting his intentions. Her tone wasn't defensive, it was hopeful. She wanted this to work. I could hear it in her voice. The engagement came faster than I expected. They told me over dinner, hands clasped, faces bright with anticipation. My mother watched me closely as she spoke, waiting for a reaction. I congratulated them. I meant it in the way people mean things they know they can't stop. He stood then and made a toast. To new beginnings, to building something together, to family. The word landed heavily in the room. He looked at me when he said it, and for the first time, there was no attempt to soften the look in his eyes. After that night, things shifted more noticeably. He spoke as if decisions had already been made. He talked about combining finances, about moving eventually, about how routines would change. He didn't ask my mother if she agreed. He spoke as if agreement were assumed. I began to understand my role in his story. I wasn't an enemy, not yet. I was an inconvenience, a variable he hadn't planned for, and like any good strategist, he intended to reduce variables as quickly and quietly as possible. The night before they announced the wedding date, I watched my mother fold laundry while he sat at the table reviewing paperwork. He corrected her gently when she misremembered a detail. She apologized without realizing she was doing it. He accepted it with a nod. I stood there unseen and felt something settle in my chest. Not fear, not anger. Clarity. He wasn't marrying just my mother. He was claiming territory. The change didn't happen all at once. It crept in quietly, disguised as improvement, as structure, as someone finally taking charge. After the engagement, he stopped acting like a guest and started behaving like the future owner of everything my mother touched. He didn't announce it. He didn't have to. The shift was in the way he moved through the house, the way he spoke as if plans were already settled. He began by reorganizing small things. The pantry, the hallway closet, the stack of mail my mother kept by the door. He explained each change calmly, logically, as if he were solving problems we hadn't known we had. My mother listened, nodded, thanked him. I watched from the side, noting how often she deferred, how rarely she questioned. Then the comments started. Not insults, not directly. Little jokes delivered with a smile. He'd look at my shoes and say something about practicality over polish. He'd comment on my work schedule and joke that I must enjoy chaos. When I didn't laugh, he'd raise an eyebrow and say he was only teasing. If I did laugh, the joke would land harder the next time. Other people heard nothing wrong. That was the point. The jokes only went one way, and they only landed where they were meant to. I learned quickly that responding made me look defensive. Silence made me look sulky. There was no correct reaction. He had engineered it that way. My mother noticed the tension but misunderstood its source. She told me he was adjusting, that blending families took time. She asked me to be patient, to give him the benefit of the doubt. I wanted to ask why patience was always expected from the person with less power. Instead, I nodded and told her I understood. The house itself began to feel different. Rules emerged without being named. Dinner times shifted. Guests were discussed before being invited. He spoke about noise levels, about productivity, about how important it was to maintain a certain atmosphere. He framed everything as concern for my mother's well-being. If she seemed tired, it was because she took on too much. If there was friction, it was because stress affected everyone differently. One evening, I came home later than usual. He glanced at the clock and commented that routines mattered. That unpredictability created anxiety. He said it casually, not as an accusation. My mother apologized before I could respond. That was the moment I realized the rules weren't just about behavior. They were about permission. He started pulling my mother aside for private conversations. I could tell when they'd happened by the way she returned quieter, her shoulders drawn in slightly, her eyes avoiding mine. When I asked if everything was all right, she said yes too quickly. When I pressed, she told me not to worry, that she had everything under control. The first time he turned me into the problem outright, it was during a conversation about living arrangements. He spoke slowly, carefully, as if choosing words from a limited set. He said transitions were easier when people had space to grow independently. He said my mother and I had been through a lot together, but this was a new chapter. He said clinging to old dynamics could prevent everyone from moving forward. I listened without interrupting. He didn't accuse me of anything directly. He didn't have to. The implication hung in the air between us, heavy and unmistakable. I was the obstacle, the reminder of a life before him, the friction point in his carefully planned future. When I brought it up with my mother later, she sighed. She said he didn't mean it that way. She said he was only worried about me becoming dependent. She said he wanted what was best for everyone. Her voice carried a note of pleading, as if she needed me to believe that more than she needed me to agree. I watched her change in small, heartbreaking ways. She asked permission before making plans she used to decide on her own. She checked his reaction before laughing too loudly. She began apologizing for things that didn't require apology. If she contradicted him, she softened it immediately, turning statements into questions. The woman who had taught me dignity without words was learning how to disappear politely. The realization that this wasn't temporary came on an ordinary afternoon. My mother had made an appointment without consulting him. When she mentioned it, he paused, smiled, and said it would have been better to discuss it first. His tone was mild, almost kind. She froze, then nodded, promising to be more careful. Something in me went still. This wasn't adjustment. This wasn't stress. This was control laid down piece by piece, normalized through repetition. That night, I lay awake listening to the sounds of the house. His footsteps, her quiet movements, doors closing softly. I understood then that staying meant complicity, that my presence wasn't protecting her the way I'd hoped. It was making his job easier, giving him a reason to frame every tension as my fault. In the morning, my mother avoided my eyes. He poured coffee and spoke about the weather. Life continued as if nothing had shifted, but everything had. I realized with painful clarity that if I stayed, I wouldn't be a shield. I would be a tool. The moment that finally forced a choice didn't look dramatic from the outside. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no tears in the kitchen. It was an ordinary evening, the kind people forget the next day, which made it worse. Those are the moments that change your life without asking permission. It started with a conversation about the house. Not moving out, not yet. Just adjustments, he said. Practical ones. He spoke as if the decision had already been weighed, measured, and finalized. He said it made sense for everyone to have clearly defined roles, especially now that things were changing. He talked about efficiency, about harmony, about avoiding unnecessary friction. My mother sat at the table, hands folded, listening. When she glanced at me, it was brief, uncertain. I could see her trying to read my face, trying to anticipate what I might say so she could soften it before it landed. He looked at me, then calm and steady, and said that independence was important, that young adults needed space to grow, that sometimes love meant letting go even when it was uncomfortable. He smiled when he said it, as if he were offering wisdom rather than an ultimatum. I waited for my mother to speak. She didn't. I asked a simple question. When would this be happening? He answered without hesitation. Soon. No exact date. Soon enough that everyone could adjust naturally. Naturally. The word hung there weightless and cruel. After dinner, he asked to speak with me privately. We stood in the living room while my mother washed dishes in the kitchen, the sound of running water filling the silence. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten me. He didn't need to. He said my mother had been under a lot of stress. That change was hard for her. That she needed calm, not conflict. He said he could tell I cared about her, but that sometimes caring meant knowing when to step back. He framed it as concern, as guidance, as if he were helping me mature. Then he said it. That my presence, however well-intentioned, was complicating things. That it might be best if I started planning my next chapter elsewhere. I asked him directly if he was asking me to leave. He paused just long enough to appear thoughtful, then said he was asking me to consider what was healthiest for everyone involved. The conversation ended there. He didn't push, he didn't follow up. He let the implication do the work. I went to my room and closed the door, my hands shaking just enough that I had to sit down. I stared at the walls, the familiar marks, the shelves I had filled over the years. It struck me then how quickly a place can stop feeling like home without physically changing at all. Later that night, I went to my mother. I didn't accuse. I didn't argue. I just asked her one question quietly, carefully, the way you approach something fragile. Do you want me here? She froze. I saw the answer in her hesitation before she spoke. She said she loved me. She said of course she did. She said things were just complicated right now. She said we would figure something out. She didn't say yes. That was the moment something broke. Not loudly, not visibly. Something internal and irreversible. I realized that whatever choice she was making it by not making it at all. Peace, even a false one, had become more important than clarity. I went back to my room and started packing. Not angrily, methodically. Clothes first, books, the things that mattered. I left behind anything that felt like it belonged to a version of me that no longer existed. He didn't stop me. In fact, he didn't comment at all. When he saw the boxes, he nodded as if this were the logical conclusion to a reasonable discussion. My mother hovered in doorways, offering help she didn't insist on. She apologized repeatedly for nothing specific, for everything all at once. The morning I left the house was quiet. He had already gone out. My mother walked me to the door, her face drawn and tired. She hugged me tightly, as if holding on could undo the decision she hadn't made. I told her it was okay. I told her I understood. Those were the lies I needed her to believe so she could survive the day. My first place was small, smaller than I had imagined. A single room with a kitchenette and a window that faced a brick wall. It smelled faintly of old paint and someone else's cooking. I set my mattress on the floor and sat on it, listening to the unfamiliar quiet. That night alone in a space that was entirely mine, I felt everything at once. Fear, relief, grief, a strange hollow calm. I cried until there was nothing left, then lay there staring at the ceiling, letting the reality settle in. I didn't know what came next. I didn't have a plan that extended beyond the next paycheck. I didn't know how long it would take to rebuild, or what rebuilding would even look like. What I did know was that I couldn't go back. There were things I didn't say before I left, not because I was afraid, but because they didn't belong to that moment. I didn't tell him what I was capable of. I didn't tell my mother what I was already working toward. Some truths are wasted on people who would only use them against you. Silence. I had learned could be a form of protection. In the days that followed, my phone stayed mostly quiet. A few messages from my mother, none from him. The distance between us stretched quickly as if it had been waiting for permission. I began to understand that leaving wasn't an act of punishment. It was an act of preservation. Staying would have required me to shrink, to accept a version of myself that fit more neatly into his vision. Leaving meant uncertainty, but it also meant possibility. The night I locked my door for the first time, truly locked it, I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, my hand resting on the knob. I thought about everything I was walking away from. I thought about everything I refused to give up. I didn't leave to make a point. I left because staying would have erased me. For a long time after I left, I didn't exist to him anymore. And that, I learned quickly, was exactly how he preferred it. In his mind, people who left quietly failed quietly. They disappeared into smaller lives, into excuses and what-ifs. He never checked. He never asked. He assumed the story had ended the way stories like mine were supposed to end. Those were the years he never saw. The first months on my own were brutal in ways I didn't admit to anyone. I worked jobs that didn't impress and hours that didn't forgive. I learned which grocery stores marked down food late at night and which buses ran even when it rained. Every bill felt personal. Every unexpected expense felt like a test I hadn't studied for. There was no safety net, no one to call if I miscalculated. I told myself that this was the price of freedom, and some nights I believed it. Other nights I sat on the edge of my mattress and wondered if I had made the biggest mistake of my life. There were moments when the idea of going back flickered in my mind, not because I missed him, but because exhaustion has a way of rewriting logic. I didn't go back. Instead, I learned how to be invisible in useful ways. At my first real job, I kept my head down and my notes meticulous. I listened more than I spoke. I watched how decisions were made, not how they were announced. I learned quickly who actually held influence and who simply liked to sound important. No one paid much attention to me, and that suited me just fine. Being underestimated is a strange kind of advantage. People talk freely around you. They reveal priorities without realizing it. They assume you won't remember, won't connect dots, won't act. I remembered everything. There was a year when everything nearly collapsed. I took a risk. I wasn't ready for trusted someone who spoke with confidence instead of substance and paid for it. Money disappeared faster than I could explain. Opportunities closed. For the first time since I'd left, fear wasn't abstract. It was practical and immediate. I remember standing in the bathroom of my tiny apartment, staring at my reflection, asking myself if this was the moment I was supposed to admit defeat. If this was where the story looped back on itself, proving him right in every quiet, humiliating way. I didn't call my mother. I didn't call anyone. What I did instead was sit down with the mess and take it apart piece by piece. I went through numbers until they made sense again. I replayed conversations and identified exactly where I had ignored my instincts. I learned that failure isn't always about being wrong. Sometimes it's about being early, or trusting the wrong voice, or wanting things to work so badly that you stop asking the right questions. That failure hardened something in me, but it also sharpened me. Not long after, I met the woman who would change the trajectory of my life. She wasn't a mentor in the cinematic sense. There were no speeches, no dramatic interventions. She was older, precise, and unimpressed by ambition without discipline. She noticed my work before she noticed me, and when she finally spoke to me, it was to ask why I hadn't applied for something I was already qualified to do. I told her I didn't think I was ready. She looked at me for a long moment and said, "Readiness was often a story people told themselves to avoid risk." Then she handed me a folder and told me to read it carefully, not quickly. Carefully. Working with her was unlike anything I'd experienced. She didn't rescue me. She didn't protect me from consequences. She taught me how to think several steps ahead, how to document everything, how to let other people underestimate me while I built leverage quietly. She taught me that real power almost never raises its voice. Under her guidance, I learned skills I didn't know had names: pattern recognition, strategic patience, emotional regulation under pressure. I learned how to sit in meetings and say nothing while absorbing everything. I learned how to make decisions without needing validation. Most importantly, I learned how to wait without stagnating. Years passed that way. Not dramatically. Progress rarely is. I advanced in increments that would have bored anyone looking for spectacle. But each step was deliberate, each move layered on the last, While he was busy believing I had vanished, I was positioning myself where I needed to be. My relationship with my mother existed in fragments during that time. Occasional calls, polite updates, conversations that avoided anything real. I could hear how tired she sounded, how careful her words had become. There were moments when I almost told her everything, when the urge to reach back and pull her out nearly overwhelmed me. I didn't. Not yet. I knew I wasn't strong enough to protect both of us. If I returned too soon, I would become the problem again, the excuse, the source of tension he could manipulate. Distance was the only thing keeping the situation from escalating faster. There were nights I lay awake imagining how different things might have been if she had chosen differently, if she had spoken up, if I had stayed. Those thoughts led nowhere good, so I learned to set them aside. You can't build a future while negotiating with a past that refuses to change. The moment I realized I was ready for more didn't come with fireworks. It came with a document. A proposal that crossed my desk late one afternoon, dense and unassuming. I read it once, then again, slower. By the third time, my hands were steady, and my mind was already moving ahead. This wasn't survival anymore. This was choice. I closed my office door and sat back, letting the weight of that realization settle. For years, I had focused on staying upright, on not falling backward. Somewhere along the way, without announcing it to myself, I had crossed a line. I was no longer reacting. I was selecting. I didn't think about him in that moment, not consciously. But later, as I walked home through the city lights, I understood something with quiet certainty. The life he assumed I'd failed into was the life that had prepared me for exactly what came next. He thought I had disappeared. What he never understood was that I had been building in the dark. The name stopped me in a way nothing else had in years. I was reviewing proposals late one afternoon, the kind of routine work that no longer stirred much emotion. Numbers, projections, language polished until it meant very little. Then I saw it. The company. The one he talked about with that same rehearsed confidence, the one he treated like proof of his worth, the one that paid for the life he had used to edge me out of my own home. I didn't feel anger. I didn't smile. I didn't even pause for long. I simply leaned back in my chair and read it again, slower this time, letting the recognition settle without reacting to it. This was not coincidence. It was timing. From the outside, the company looked solid enough. Clean website, carefully worded press releases, a modest but respectable presence in the market. The kind of business people described as stable, even when they didn't fully understand what it did. Stability is a comforting illusion. People cling to it because it makes them feel safe. I had learned to look past appearances. As I dug into the details, the inconsistencies began to surface. Revenue that relied too heavily on a few long-standing relationships. Decision-making that favored speed over sustainability. A leadership structure that looked impressive on paper but lacked redundancy. It wasn't failing, not yet. But it was fragile in ways that wouldn't be obvious to anyone who didn't know how to read between the lines. And he didn't. His role sat near the top, visible, and well compensated. He liked titles. He liked the way they sounded when he said them out loud. What he didn't seem to understand was how dependent his position was on forces he didn't control. He was not the foundation. He was a layer built on assumptions, and assumptions collapse quietly before they collapse completely. I didn't tell anyone what I had found. Not my colleagues, not my mentor. This wasn't secrecy driven by fear. It was discretion driven by clarity. The moment I shared it, the narrative would shift. People would start drawing conclusions, offering advice, projecting outcomes. I needed none of that. I needed space to think. There was a choice to be made, and I weighed it carefully. I could walk away. Let someone else discover the weaknesses. Let the system correct itself in its own time. That would have been clean, detached, safe. Or I could step closer, not as myself, not as the person he remembered or thought he had erased, but through structures he would never question, through channels he respected because they spoke the language he understood. Money, authority, silence. I chose the second option. The first contact was indirect, an inquiry from a holding entity with no personal ties, professional, curious, non-committal. Exactly the kind of attention the company was eager to attract. They responded quickly, almost too quickly, their enthusiasm thinly veiled beneath formality. As discussions progressed, I kept my name out of it. My presence existed only through documents, emails, carefully worded calls that never revealed more than necessary. I watched how they responded to pressure, how they negotiated, how they prioritized. He never appeared on those calls. That didn't surprise me. He had always considered that kind of work beneath him. Let others handle the details, he believed. His job was vision, influence, being seen. It made things easier. With each exchange, the leverage grew, small at first, then noticeable. The company began to adjust its posture, anticipating opportunity. Decisions were made with an eye toward future funding that hadn't been promised. Momentum shifted subtly, and no one questioned why. I stayed patient. The first advantage came without my asking for it. A request for guidance. A question about direction. They framed it as collaboration, but it was dependence forming in real time. I responded slowly, thoughtfully, offering just enough to shape outcomes without revealing intent. I thought about my mother during those moments, about how easily people trust confidence, how often they mistake direction for safety. I wondered if she sensed the same fragility I now saw so clearly, or if the comfort of certainty had blinded her the way it blinded so many others. As my involvement deepened, I learned more about the internal dynamics. Who actually did the work? Who cleaned up mistakes? Who absorbed blame quietly? It was familiar in a way that made my stomach tighten. Patterns repeat because people don't change as much as they think they do. He still didn't know. That knowledge sat with me heavy and precise. I didn't feel powerful. I felt responsible. Once you see how a system really functions, you can't unsee it. You can't pretend ignorance and call it neutrality. Not if you understand what's at stake. I moved carefully documenting everything. Decisions, timelines, conversations. Not because I planned to use them, but because I might need to. Preparation is not accusation. It's insurance. There was a moment late one night when I considered whether this was crossing a line, whether I was becoming something I had once resented. The thought didn't last long. Power used to dominate is not the same as power used to contain harm. Intent matters. So does restraint. I never sought him out. I never watched from a distance. I didn't need to. His world was moving closer to mine, whether he realized it or not. Each step he took toward what he thought was growth brought him deeper into a structure he didn't understand. The trap, if you could call it that, was not built with malice. It was built with inevitability. Systems fail when they are exposed to their own weaknesses. All I had done was remove the insulation. One afternoon, an email came through confirming the next phase of involvement. Formal, official, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what it meant. I read it once, then closed my laptop and sat in silence for a moment. This was no longer theoretical. He thought the company was finally moving forward. He thought stability was within reach. He thought the future was aligning the way it always had, bending gently in his favor. What he never asked was who was pushing it and what they might want in return. By the time my involvement became unavoidable, the company had already adjusted itself around my presence. Meetings were scheduled differently. Proposals were worded more carefully. Decisions that once moved on instinct now waited for confirmation. Influence doesn't announce itself. It shows up in hesitation in the way people start asking before acting. I still hadn't shown my face. From his perspective, this was success. New capital, new interest. A sense that the business was finally being taken seriously by people who mattered. I could almost hear the way he talked about it at home, framing it as validation. Proof that his instincts had been right all along. The irony was precise. The first time my conditions were introduced, they came disguised as standard procedure. Oversight, transparency, accountability, nothing radical, nothing threatening, just enough structure to expose habits that had never been questioned. The board approved them without resistance. They wanted the funding, they wanted the credibility, and they trusted that anyone bringing this level of investment knew what they were doing. He didn't object, at least not publicly. That would have required reading the fine print, engaging with details he'd long outsourced. Instead, he made a show of confidence, telling colleagues this was a sign of growth of maturity. He congratulated himself for attracting attention from serious players. Behind the scenes, the adjustments began to strain him. Suddenly, decisions required justification. Expense reports were reviewed. Projections had to align with reality. Meetings he used to skip now required attendance. The margin for improvisation narrowed, and with it his comfort. He adapted the way he always did, by deflecting, by reframing, by leaning on the people beneath him to absorb the pressure. I watched it happen through reports and quiet conversations, through the patterns that always emerge when someone mistakes authority for competence. It was during this phase that I learned how deeply his identity was tied to control. Not leadership, control. He didn't mind collaboration as long as it reinforced his position. He didn't mind structure as long as it bent around him. The moment it didn't, he grew restless. I also learned something else. My mother had been used as collateral, not officially, not in a way that would raise alarms immediately, but her name appeared in documents connected to the company's stability, guarantees, assurances, signatures that shifted risk without shifting benefit. The kind of thing people sign when they trust without understanding. Seeing it in black and white made my hands shake. This wasn't just about professional recklessness. This was personal in a way that cut through every layer of restraint I'd built. He hadn't just pushed me out. He had leveraged her existence to secure his own position, betting on her loyalty the same way he bet on other people's silence. I didn't confront him. I didn't call my mother. Not yet. Emotion is expensive. It clouds timing, and timing was everything. Instead, I adjusted the next phase. Quietly, legally, completely within bounds. Safeguards were introduced. Requirements tightened. Liability shifted back where it belonged. Each change was justified, documented, approved. No accusations, no drama, just correction. The effect was immediate. The pressure he had been deflecting now had nowhere to go. The buffers disappeared. The protections he assumed were permanent revealed themselves as conditional. His authority, once assumed, began to feel provisional. I could sense his frustration even without seeing him. It came through in emails sent too late at night, in the way language sharpened, in the sudden urgency behind requests that used to be casual. Control slipping makes people loud in small ways. Still, he didn't know it was me. There were moments when I wondered what he would think if he did, if recognition would bring rage or fear, if he would laugh it off, try to charm his way through it, insist on familiarity as leverage. I didn't dwell on those questions. Speculation had no value now. What mattered was the structure holding. As the situation tightened, others began to notice. People who had worked under him for years started speaking more carefully, documenting more thoroughly. Some reached out indirectly, offering context history, quiet warnings. They didn't frame it as betrayal. They framed it as relief. It became clear that I wasn't the only one who had been waiting for the right moment. I was simply the first with the means to act. The final preparation wasn't dramatic. No secret meetings, no late-night plotting, just alignment. Making sure every piece sat where it needed to. That nothing depended on emotion or impulse. That when the moment came, it would unfold exactly as designed. I scheduled my appearance the same way I scheduled everything else. Calmly, professionally, without symbolism or theatrics. I didn't need a stage. The boardroom would do. The night before, I slept better than I had in weeks. Not because I was eager, because I was finished waiting. I thought briefly of the girl who had packed boxes in silence, who had locked a door behind her without knowing what came next. I wondered if she would recognize this version of herself, if she would understand that none of this was about revenge in the way people imagine it. This was about restoring balance. By morning, the decision was irreversible. Notices had been sent, attendance confirmed, documents prepared. Everything was in motion. He believed the meeting would secure his future. I knew it would end the illusion he had built his life on. And for the first time since I had seen that company name on a proposal, I allowed myself to feel something close to certainty. Not satisfaction. Readiness. The room smelled like polished wood and coffee that had been sitting too long on a warming plate. I arrived early, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted to see the space before it filled with voices. Boardrooms tell the truth when they're empty. Who sits where? Who faces the door? Who assumes the head of the table without being invited? He would take that seat. He always did. I took a chair near the middle, unremarkable angle just enough to observe without performing. My name on the agenda was listed formally, without context, without history. Just another representative. Just another presence. People filtered in gradually. Executives. Advisors. A few board members whose expressions suggested long familiarity with compromise. They greeted each other with practiced warmth, the kind that didn't require trust. He arrived last as expected, carrying himself with the ease of someone who believed the room existed for him. He didn't look at me at first. He launched into conversation, immediately shaking hands, laughing too loudly, setting a tone of confidence he mistook for authority. I watched him work the room the way I'd seen him work my mother's attention years ago, redirecting, reframing, making others feel slightly off balance while he stayed centered. When the meeting was called to order, he took the head seat without asking. No one stopped him. Habits once established are hard to interrupt. The opening reports were routine. Financial summaries, operational updates, carefully worded optimism layered over quiet concern. I followed along without comment, noting the places where reality strained against presentation. He nodded through it all, occasionally interjecting with commentary that sounded insightful without adding substance. Then the agenda shifted. The tone changed subtly. Less performance. More precision. Questions were asked that hadn't been asked before. Requests for clarification. References to documentation. The kind of inquiries that don't accuse but don't reassure either. I felt the room tighten. He noticed it too. I saw it in the way his posture adjusted, the way his fingers tapped once against the table before stilling. He smiled through it, but the smile was thinner, now stretched across attention that was no longer fully his. When my turn came, there was no dramatic pause, no announcement. Just a name and a title read aloud, the way it always is when something important is about to be overlooked. I stood. The sound of my chair against the floor was louder than it should have been, or maybe the room had simply gone quiet. I spoke calmly, deliberately, presenting facts without commentary context, without emotion. I outlined inconsistencies. I highlighted dependencies. I referenced the safeguards that had been introduced and why they were necessary. He watched me then. Really watched me. At first, there was only confusion, the polite kind, the kind reserved for people who don't immediately register as threats. He tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing as he tried to place me within a framework that no longer fit. As I continued, the confusion gave way to recognition. It didn't arrive all at once. It crept across his face slowly, the way truth does when there's nowhere left to hide it. His eyes lingered on mine a second too long. His jaw tightened. I saw memory click into place, connecting dots he hadn't realized were related. I didn't acknowledge it. I moved on to the documentation. The guarantees, the exposure, the way personal assurances had been used to offset professional risk. I spoke carefully when I mentioned my mother, referring to her only as a private individual whose assets had been improperly entangled. That was when his composure fractured. He interrupted me, voice sharper than before, demanding clarification, asking why this was the first he was hearing of it, questioning the interpretation of the data. His words came faster now, overlapping urgency creeping in around the edges. I waited for him to finish. Then I answered one question at a time, calmly, precisely, with references he couldn't refute. The room shifted again, this time away from him, attention reoriented, authority recalibrated. When I finally looked directly at him, it was not with anger or satisfaction. It was with recognition, the kind that strips away performance and leaves only what's real. I introduced myself fully then, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough. My name landed in the room like something dropped, not thrown, a fact, not an accusation. I watched it echo across faces as people processed the connection. I watched understanding spread outward, quiet and unstoppable. He stared at me as if the floor had shifted under his feet. For a moment I thought he might laugh, dismiss it, try to charm his way out the way he always had. Instead, he said nothing. The silence stretched heavy and unforgiving. The chair beside him creaked, as someone leaned back, reconsidering their position. A board member cleared their throat. The meeting moved forward without waiting for him to recover. Decisions were made. Funding was paused. Oversight intensified. Authority redistributed. Each resolution passed methodically, without drama, without spectacle. He tried to object once more, but the room no longer bent around him. His words landed flat, unsupported. I sat back down when it was over, my hand steady, my pulse slow. I felt no rush of triumph, no release of long-held fury. What I felt instead was a strange, profound neutrality. This wasn't revenge. This was consequence. As the meeting adjourned, people gathered their things quietly. Some avoided his eyes. Others nodded at me with something like respect, or perhaps relief. He remained seated, staring at the table, his reflection warped in the polished surface. I stood and walked past him without stopping. He said my name then. Not loudly, not confidently. It sounded smaller than I remembered. I turned just enough to acknowledge him, not enough to invite conversation. For the first time since I'd known him, he had nothing left to say that mattered. And for the first time in years, neither did I. The fallout didn't explode. It unraveled. That was the part he never anticipated. In the days after the meeting, there were no headlines, no dramatic exits, no shouting matches in glass offices. Instead, there were emails that went unanswered. Calls returned later than usual. Meetings rescheduled, then quietly canceled. Authority doesn't vanish in a single moment. It erodes when people stop pretending. He felt it immediately. I know because my mother called me 3 nights later. Her voice tight in that familiar way she used when she didn't want to alarm me. She didn't say his name at first. She talked around it, describing the house as tense, describing him as distracted, describing how he barely slept, and snapped at small things. I listened, without interrupting, letting her words settle into their own shape. Then she asked me very softly if I knew what was happening. I told her the truth. Not all of it. Not yet. Just enough to replace confusion with clarity. I explained that the company was under review, that decisions had been made, that things were changing. I told her she hadn't done anything wrong. That last part mattered most. She was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, she said she had felt it. The shift, the way his certainty had thinned, the way his confidence now came edged with irritation instead of ease. She said it was like living with someone whose reflection had cracked and who was angry at the mirror for it. The next morning, he didn't go to work. That alone told me how deeply the illusion had been shaken. He had always believed in visibility, in showing up and being seen as indispensable. For him to stay home meant the ground beneath him was no longer stable enough to stand on. What followed was a slow exposure. Documents were requested, explanations required, protections triggered automatically. Processes he had ignored for years now demanded his attention, and he didn't know how to meet them. The people who once buffered his mistakes had stepped back, no longer willing to absorb risk for someone whose position was no longer guaranteed. He reacted the only way he knew how, by tightening his grip. At home, that meant control turned brittle. Questions became accusations. Suggestions became commands. My mother told me he criticized how she spoke to people on the phone, how she managed her time, how she handled money. Things he had never noticed before suddenly became intolerable flaws. She said it felt like being audited for her own existence. The breaking point came quietly over something so small it almost feels ridiculous in retrospect. A piece of mail. Official, unassuming. She had opened it by accident, thinking it was hers. It outlined obligations she hadn't realized she carried. Guarantees tied to assets she thought were protected. She confronted him that night. Not angrily, not dramatically. She asked him to explain. He didn't. He deflected. He minimized. He told her she wouldn't understand. He said it was temporary, necessary, under control. When she asked why he hadn't told her, his patience snapped. He told her she was overreacting, that she should trust him, that she was being ungrateful. She told me later that it was the word ungrateful that broke something open in her. She had given him loyalty, silence, space, and belief. She had given him her name where it mattered and her absence where it didn't. And now, with the ground shifting beneath him, he expected gratitude for the risk she hadn't consented to carry. That night she slept in the guest room. He tried to smooth it over the next day, but the timing was wrong. Apologies offered after exposure rarely land the way they're intended to. She had seen too much, heard too clearly. The narrative he had built around himself no longer held. The unraveling accelerated. At work, his role was reduced to function, then to oversight, then to review. Each adjustment came framed as temporary procedural necessary. Each one stripped away another layer of identity he had mistaken for permanence. He grew louder as his influence shrank. At home, my mother stopped shrinking. She didn't announce it. She didn't make threats. She simply began asking questions he couldn't answer without admitting the truth. She began reading documents instead of trusting summaries. She began making plans that didn't include him by default. When she called me after she packed a bag and left the house for the first time, I knew the hardest part was over. She didn't cry. She sounded exhausted but clear. She told me she was staying with a friend. She told me she needed space. She told me she finally understood why I had left when I did. I drove to see her the next day. She looked older than I remembered, and younger than she had in years, like someone stepping out of a long shadow into unfamiliar light. We sat at a small table in a borrowed kitchen, drinking coffee that tasted like freedom more than comfort. She asked me how long I had known he would fall. I told her I hadn't known. I had prepared. There is a difference. His collapse when it came was administrative, not cinematic. His contract was restructured, then terminated, not for scandal, but for risk. The most damning reason of all, no one wanted to be responsible for him anymore. He tried to reach out to me once. The message was brief, carefully worded. A request to talk, to clear the air, to understand what had happened, as if what had happened were a misunderstanding instead of a reckoning. I didn't respond. Some conversations only exist to preserve illusion. I had no interest in offering him another one. What surprised me most was not how quickly his world narrowed, but how little space it had contained to begin with. Without position, without leverage, without an audience willing to play along, there was very little left. My mother filed paperwork the following week. Quietly, efficiently, with a steadiness that reminded me of the woman who once taught me how to balance a checkbook and stand my ground at the same time. She told me she felt ashamed for not seeing it sooner. I told her shame belongs to the person who benefits from deception, not the person who survives it. By the end of the month, his name no longer carried weight in rooms that once deferred to it. His voice, once amplified by certainty, now echoed only in places that still believed performance mattered more than truth. The system had not punished him, it had simply stopped protecting him, and that I realized was the most complete form of justice there is. The silence that followed felt unfamiliar, not because it was loud before, but because for the first time in years, it wasn't tense. It was the kind of quiet that didn't demand attention, didn't brace for impact. My mother moved through her days slowly at first, as if testing the ground with each step to make sure it would hold. We spoke more during that time, not about him, not directly, about ordinary things, what she wanted to cook, the neighbor's dog, the way mornings felt different when no one was watching the clock for you. Those conversations mattered more than any dramatic debrief ever could. They were proof that life was resuming its natural rhythm. There were practical matters to address, of course, paperwork, accounts, boundaries that had never existed before. I helped where I could, not as a rescuer, but as a second set of eyes. She made the decisions. I supported them. That distinction was important to both of us. One afternoon, as we sat at her small kitchen table reviewing documents, she stopped and looked at me. Really looked at me. She said she hadn't realized how much I had changed until now. Not hardened, sharpened. She said it with a mixture of pride and regret. I told her change wasn't something that happened to me. It was something I chose again and again when staying the same would have cost too much. She nodded as if filing that away. The legal processes moved at their own pace. Methodical, impersonal, exactly the opposite of how power had once been exercised in her life. It was strange to watch systems work the way they were supposed to, not perfectly, but predictably. There was comfort in that. He tried to insert himself into the process more than once. Requests for meetings, appeals framed as misunderstandings, attempts to reposition himself as reasonable cooperative wronged. Each attempt was met with the same response: procedure, distance, no exceptions. My mother didn't waver. The first time she said no to him without qualifying it, without softening it, without apologizing afterward, I saw her hands tremble slightly. Then they steadied. The moment passed. Something in her posture changed. She didn't notice it. I did. Recovery doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives in increments so small you almost miss them if you're not paying attention. She started sleeping better, eating regularly, laughing at things that had nothing to do with relief. She rearranged her living space not to erase the past, but to make room for herself again. She signed up for a class she'd once dismissed as impractical. She bought herself something unnecessary and didn't explain why. Each choice was a quiet declaration. As for me, I returned to my life without the constant hum of anticipation. The work continued, projects advanced, responsibilities shifted. But something fundamental had changed. I was no longer bracing for an outcome. The outcome had already occurred. What remained was stewardship. People reached out to me in unexpected ways, not to congratulate, not to pry, to ask questions, to share experiences, to say they had recognized pieces of themselves in what they had witnessed, even if they didn't have language for it at the time. I listened more than I spoke. There was one evening months later when I ran into him by chance. A public place, neutral ground. He looked smaller, not physically, but spatially, like someone whose presence no longer shaped the room around him. He saw me, hesitated, then nodded as if that settled something for him. I nodded back. Nothing more passed between us. No words, no reckoning, no closure. And as I walked away, I realized I didn't want any. Closure is often just another performance. I had already taken what mattered. What surprised me most was how little space he occupied in my thoughts afterward. Once the tension dissolved, there was nothing left to orbit around. He became a fact, not a force, a chapter, not a theme. My mother asked me once if I ever felt guilty. I considered the question carefully before answering. Guilt implies responsibility for harm. What had happened was exposure, not injury, consequences, not cruelty. I told her that if someone builds their life on imbalance, correcting it will always feel like an attack to them. She smiled a small, knowing smile and said she was glad I hadn't learned that lesson the hard way. We visited the place where I had lived alone for the first time after leaving. The building was still there, unchanged. The window still faced the same brick wall. I told her how scared I had been back then, how uncertain everything had felt. She squeezed my hand and said she wished she had known. I told her knowing wouldn't have changed the timing. It might have changed the outcome, but it wouldn't have spared either of us the work. That work had shaped us differently, but it had shaped us honestly. In the months that followed, my mother began to reintroduce herself to the world. Not dramatically, carefully, on her terms. She met new people, rekindled old connections. She didn't rush into anything. She didn't need to. Being alone no longer felt like a verdict. It felt like a choice. Watching her reclaim that agency was more satisfying than anything I had imagined when this all began. Not because it validated my actions, but because it confirmed my belief that people don't need saving. They need space. As for me, I continued to operate in rooms that once would have intimidated me. The difference now was internal. I no longer needed to prove I belonged there. Belonging had become irrelevant. I was there because I had something to contribute. That was enough. Every so often I caught myself waiting for the other shoe to drop, for consequences, for backlash, for regret to surface unexpectedly. It never did. Not because there was nothing to regret, but because regret requires the belief that you chose incorrectly. I hadn't. What remained was something quieter and more durable than satisfaction. Clarity. The kind that doesn't demand applause. The kind that lets you move forward without checking behind you. The kind that reminds you that power doesn't always look like force. Sometimes it looks like walking away, standing still, and letting the truth finish what it started. The morning light came in through the window without asking permission, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't flinch when it touched my face. There was no rush, no sense that something was about to go wrong if I lingered. Just a quiet room and a day that belonged to me. I made coffee and stood there while it brewed, listening to the ordinary sounds of a life that had finally settled into itself. The refrigerator hum, a car passing outside, my own breathing steady and unguarded. Peace, I learned, doesn't announce itself. It slips in when you're no longer bracing for impact. People sometimes ask what I gained from all of this. They expect a list, money, influence, status, something tangible that can be measured and envied. I understand the question, even if I don't answer it the way they want. What I took back wasn't visible. I took back my right to exist without explanation, my right to speak without calculating consequences, my right to be present in rooms where I had once been quietly erased. Those things don't show up on balance sheets, but they change everything. I watched my mother rediscover herself in ways that still surprise me. Not dramatically, not with declarations or reinvention, with small choices that added up over time. She planted herbs on her windowsill. She took long walks without checking the clock. She stopped apologizing when she changed her mind. One afternoon, she told me she had started painting again, landscapes mostly. Nothing she planned to show anyone, just colors and space and movement. She said it made her feel like herself in a way she hadn't felt in years. I told her that was the point. Seeing her reclaim that joy did something to me that no victory ever could. It reminded me why I had waited, why I had moved carefully, why restraint had mattered as much as action. This had never been about watching someone fall. It had been about watching someone rise. As for my own life, it didn't transform overnight. It didn't need to. I continued working, continued building, continued choosing substance over spectacle. The difference was internal. I no longer felt the need to prove that I deserved the space I occupied. I had earned it, and more importantly, I knew it. There is a particular kind of strength that comes from surviving quietly, from doing the work without witnesses, from becoming formidable without announcing it to the world. It doesn't look impressive from the outside, but it endures. Every now and then I catch myself thinking about the girl I was when all of this began, the one who packed boxes in silence, the one who locked a door behind her without knowing what waited on the other side. I wish I could tell her that she didn't leave because she was weak. She left because she refused to disappear. If there is one thing this experience taught me, it's that power doesn't always come from confrontation. Sometimes it comes from patience, from preparation, from understanding systems well enough to let them do what they're designed to do once the truth is exposed. Bullies rely on chaos. Manipulators rely on silence. Both crumble when faced with clarity. I don't pretend that this path is easy or that it's the right one for everyone. Every situation is different. Every person carries their own limits, their own risks, their own timing. What I know is this: no one gets to define your worth by how small they can make you feel. If someone in your life benefits from you doubting yourself, that doubt was never yours to begin with. Sometimes justice isn't loud. Sometimes it doesn't look like revenge at all. Sometimes it looks like a woman standing in her own kitchen, breathing freely, painting landscapes that belong only to her. Sometimes it looks like another woman moving through the world without flinching, no longer waiting for permission to take up space. That kind of ending doesn't make headlines, but it lasts. If this story resonated with you, if any part of it felt familiar, I'd love to hear your thoughts. You're not alone in these experiences, even when they feel isolating. Share what stood out to you, or simply let me know where you're listening from today. And if you want to stay for more stories about hidden strength, quiet justice, and the moments when the tables finally turn, make sure you subscribe and stay with me. There are more truths worth telling, and I'll be right here to tell them with you.